Okay. We are going to start soon. If you please could sit down. Thank you so much in advance. Oh, how are you? Okay, so it's my pleasure today to chair this very interesting session. Apologies for turning up late. I was organizing another conference in Oxford, so I had to escape. Of course, I really missed the whole thing because I've been working on the Chinese economy for 3 decades, so I would have very much have liked to learn more, but well, anyway, this is life. Okay, so we are very fortunate today to receive Dr. Thiemann, who is, I understand, a sociologist by training, who is a political science specialization. He has had a very, well, international career, starting his studies in Berlin at the prestigious Humboldt University, moving to New York to the New School, then, still in New York, Columbia University, with a thesis, a PhD thesis, which, actually already led to a book. So, of course, you should definitely also read this previous book. And in the committee, there was nobody else than Joe Stiglitz. So gives you some, recommendation to definitely read it. And now, the French system, because he's now working as associate professor in Paris at Sciences Po. Actually, I studied at Sciences Po 50 years ago. And he has gone through this very strange system. We have this called, the Germans call it habilitation. So we call it in French habilitation, which basically means you have to do further work after your PhD. This led to this book. So you see, each time he does academic work, it leads to a book. So we wish that he would have yet another stage so that we could possibly benefit even more. As you saw, the title of the book is Taming the Cycles of Finance. Well, of course, as he will tell us, I think the actual title is The Lack of Taming of the Financial Cycle, but I'm sure this is not a good title, so you are much more, a good choice. Okay, so we are going to listen to Dr. Thiemann's presentation for around 30 minutes, and we are fortunate to have an expert on financial regulation, Dr. Brownbridge, who will discuss, and then we will open the discussion to the room. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Girardin. Do I have a mic? Can you hear me? Yes. So thank you very much for being here. I know this might be a bit strange, seem a bit strange on the conference on Africa and China. My talk about this book that just came out in February at Cambridge University Press will be mostly about the West, what we call the West, the US, the UK, and the Eurozone. But I think the topic, namely the boom and bust cycles of finance, is something that travels beyond the West and can be found in many places, such as China, which just had a property boom that ended, that you may have heard about. And that puts central banks in a very particular place. And that's what I want to talk about today. The place, if you like, of central banks in today's capitalism is actually something that I didn't anticipate when I started to write this book, because what I wanted to really understand at the beginning when I started this book was, and this is going to be the outline of the talk, so it's very traditional. I'll show you the research question, the method, and the data. I'll tell you what I'm showing in the book, then to end on the conclusion of the unhappy consciousness of central bankers, which is what I think is the current situation of central bankers in the world, actually. When I started to look at this, I really just wanted to understand what, if anything, changed after the financial crisis. So I started writing this book in 2012, so it was really just happened 4 years ago. And I really wanted to know what, if anything, changed And many of you will probably still remember that 2007, 2008 was rather turbulent moments. And when I did research on this back then, I worked on shadow banking. I was very much astonished about the role of financial models in blinding technocratic institutions. So when I did research on the crisis, many people told to me what surprised them most was the sudden disappearance of liquidity in financial markets. And then I found out that in the models that they used to regulate financial markets, there was one crucial assumption. There is always liquidity in financial markets. So the models that they used to think about the problem couldn't even anticipate the problems that they actually experienced. So now I was asking myself, will we see changes in the models that regulators use to regulate financial markets, to think about it? Thank you very much. And so at the same time, I was wondering if we're actually observing, maybe with the financial crisis, the end of financialization. Now, those of you who do not know the term financialization, it's the expanding growth of financial markets and their importance for growth, for economic growth. And today, 12 years later, this might really seem like a naive view and a naive question, because evidently we haven't witnessed the end of financialization. But back then I was asking myself that, and so I realized that I was taking quite a big gamble, or maybe actually I didn't realize it that much, because I thought, well, it will be done soon, will be completed the process. But I investigated in quasi-real time. That had big advantages, because I could go to the policymakers and speak to them as they were still grappling with the issues. That's an advantage as you for your method. And at the same time, you're running the risk, when is the process actually finished? When does the dust actually settle? I will claim today that the dust has settled in 2020. It's up to you to judge me whether that is actually a measure of convenience or actually convinces you as an argument. But I will argue that the what one could argue is the rather very unhealthy, or what an economist would call it, maybe the bad equilibrium in which central banks find themselves today, was locked in and shown to the world in 2020 during the COVID crisis, which is when I want to change. When I started to work on this 10 years ago, my dear fellow academics already had spoken their judgment. Was there change? Eric Alain, a very famous professor in Canada, wrote a book that is called The Status Quo Crisis. And so his answer was very evident. No, nothing much has changed. Yeah. And one argument back then, when I started to read why so little had changed, was in terms of regulation, was that there was simply no economic idea set that could really challenge the classical, the neoliberal views on finance that see finance as beneficial, as good for society, as in need of liberation. And I think back then, in the early 2010s, this statement is actually largely correct. And so if there is one thing that I would like to convince you of today, is that this statement today is no longer correct. Today, we're living in a world in which the academic mainstream on finance actually is much more and much better equipped to argue that finance is cyclical and dangerous, fragile, and in need of regulation. And what I want to argue today is that this development directly has to do with the only real challenger to pre-crisis thinking that was seen to be implemented, which is the macro-prudential idea set. The macro-prudential idea set, if you haven't heard about it, is an idea that says we need to regulate the financial system as a whole, not only the individual banks, but all of the system. And doing so, we do not only need to increase the resilience of the system to shocks, but we also need to tame the boom and bust cycles of finance. We need to limit these very dangerous developments. And so most thought of it at the moment as a mere rhetorical device. That's how Helena characterized it. And Lombardi and Moschella speak of an act of symbolic politics. They basically say the G20 in 2009 announces we will change everything, we will impose macro-prudential regulation. Then they hand over to the regulators and they leave the room. Mere symbolic politics, announcements, we shall act. But then nothing much has happened. Others think that these ideas were there, but they were emasculated. And lastly, Baker speaks of an ideational paradigm shift, a really fundamental change that still, however, was in need of new tools. And he was looking for these tools to come about, and so did I. And I think just to give you an understanding of what the macro-prudential vision actually is and why it was so challenging and actually, in a sense, I will argue, almost impossible to implement this change immediately after the financial crisis, is because it required a fundamental rethinking of finance. People like Mark Blythe have argued that before the financial crisis, finance was largely understood through the efficient market hypothesis. And the efficient market hypothesis thinks that finance follows a random walk, and because markets are liberated, they lead to optimal capital allocation. In this worldview, the epistemic authority of what is right lies with markets. The way we should see and understand risks is through the eyes of the banks, from the bottom up. And we need to integrate these views into the public risk management, which leads us in the end to a rules-based system that really only focuses on individual banks and uses risk management systems that they have developed that are benchmarked. That was the case before 2008. This is how it was approached. Now, the macro-prudential vision, we could argue, is fundamentally opposed to that. It can be linked to thinkers like Thiemann Minsky, but also to thinkers like Friedrich August von Hayek. So the jury is still out who is actually the intellectual father of this. But it maintains that finance is cyclical. That is, finance is subject to boom and bust cycles, to exaggerations, to letting itself getting carried away. And all of you maybe know about the tulip mania in the 17th century, which is often used to make this case. This leads to misallocation, and it in the end gives the epistemic authority to regulators, not to the market. So it's the regulator to judge if markets are out of whack or not. And that requires, in a sense, a way of thinking about it that allows you to measure systemic risk top down, to be able to say there's too much risk in the market as a whole, which requires intervention. And that in turn requires discretionary ex ante intervention. That is to say, when a regulator sees that things get out of whack, he should intervene. And he has to do so in a discretionary manner before it is too late. And that is really extremely demanding. And you can already think about something, you have to act on something that hasn't happened yet based on systemic risk measurements that at that point in time really didn't exist in a functional format. And so one argument why it wasn't immediately implemented, we can already give, was because all of these systemic risk measurement systems first needed to be developed. And one of the important arguments of my book is, in a sense, that economists in central banks have spent the last 10 years building these risk measurement devices. And the biggest change between 2024 and 2008 is that today, nobody anymore will be able to say, we didn't see this coming, or we didn't know, or what a surprise. Today, people know. All the problems that plague the world, in a sense, are in financial stability reports by central banks. The only problem is that there's not much action following upon it, and that will be the next step of my talk. So when we come back and we see the common answer, which is there was no paradigm shift, nothing really happened. I think the problem of my colleagues is that they, judge too fast because it was too early, but also that they operate based on a binary logic, which is almost, not to be nasty, childish, which is it is either everything or nothing. Either there's a total change or nothing has happened. And I think actually that is really not helpful to study this for different reasons that I'll try to show to you. The first thing is, I think we really need to broaden the field of study because they only look at policy. And I will argue that there are different dimensions to a policy shift that are not only in policy itself. And to do so, I will use a notion of fragmented change. Fragmented change is understood that where there are different dimensions of an overall policy paradigm, which shift at several different speeds at different points in time and led by a variety of different institutional activities. Now, why is this important? I think when we operate on a 0 or 1 level, we will just be left with nothing changed. Because there is no total revolution in regulation, nothing changed. But that will lead us to overlook all the positive developments that are there and, to my mind, give the potential to actually regulate the cycles of finance. Now, what I want to do in this book then is I study the unintended effect of the macro-prudential policy turn in 3 fields. The field of economics, the bureaucratic field that involves the central banks, and the political field. I base it on Hall, Peter Hall, very famous American Harvard political scientist, who wrote a very famous book on the political power of economic ideas, and who said, for economic ideas to be powerful, they have to be viable in these 3 respective fields. I combine this framework with an approach that says, well, if you want to intervene in something, you need to construct it as a risk object. You need to scientifically prove that systemic risk exists, that it is measurable, and that you can actually intervene. And that is the work of economists in central banks and outside of it. That takes a lot of hard work, and that is the one that I follow. So I follow these policy devices from their birth to their implementation to their activation. And as I go, I look at the creation of these policy devices that are devices that allow regulators to see systemic risk and to know when they should intervene. And I move on to the stabilization of these policy devices within central banks that are interacting with the IMF and the BIS. And I ask, do these devices gain administrative viability? So do central banks think that they can actually use these? Do they have the internal go-ahead to use these? And then I ask lastly, do they actually use them, where it's the question of political viability? So do central bankers, jointly or not, with political principles, decide to intervene to tame the cycles of finance? As you maybe already anticipate, I will argue that the biggest change has been here, and today the financial cycle is literally established as a risk object, as a concept that is spoken about in journals such as the American Economic Review. If we move on to administrative viability, I will tell you how it's a bit different in different countries. In the US, fearing the power of the market, the regulator loves to act in a hidden manner through stress tests in a way that could not be challenged by the banks. They implemented their measures. Whereas in the UK, country where we are, not far from here, the gentlemanly style of negotiation, of discussing until a joint decision could be found in the Bank of England's Financial Stability Committee led to quite some remarkable action, for example, on housing 10 years ago when Mark Carney came to this country, 11 years ago. And so lastly, political viability, it will not surprise you, is the one where we see the lowest degree of action. Why? Because politicians often shy away from implementing it. But I think also we have to ask ourselves the importance and the role of finance in stimulating economic growth. So there is not only the proverbial regulatory capture, the serving the interest of the industry, but there is also the structural or infrastructural power of financial market actors by being able to say, well, we provide the credit that drives your system. How dare you limit the cycles of finance, because you need these booms. Now, I think in this way, by linking political economy and sociology of economics, I can look at central banks as the central political economic actors of our time, which are driving the continuation of financialization and inequality even after the great financial crisis. But they are also the central nodes in the use and production of scientific knowledge on the economy. And I think this is the place that often gets ignored. Central banks do not only implement, they also innovate in terms of thinking and acting. And that's this innovation in terms of thinking and acting is what I follow in this book. So I conceptualize these actors, these central banks, as actors sitting in a space between fields, because they are, as you will know, an administration, but they're also in the market. They are in touch with politics. but also in touch with economics. And doing so, they can actually exert influence on all these fields, as much as these fields influence them, of course. But they can ally with different actors and reshape the way these different fields operate. And a crucial actor here are central bank economists, because they act as boundary walkers between these fields, where they are interacting with the market, but they also operate in an administrative unit. And they innovate to satisfy these demands of their central bank, because I don't know how many economists are in the room. There is no economist in the room. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes.
A few, yes, okay. So the many, yeah. So the question is, what drives an academic economist? That's for you to decide. I don't want to overgeneralize, but you could say it could be his curiosity, it could be his career incentives, it could be the attempt to make a real contribution to academic economics. When you are a central bank economist, you most likely have a manager that has the capacity to come into your room and say, I need a systemic risk measurement of the bond market, and I need it in 2 months. And you will collaborate with this colleague of yours that is actually knowing about finance, and you are a macroeconomist, and you will collaborate. And that's how it was told to me in these interviews. But that's what happened at the ECB. And that leads to innovation in a way that we do not see in academic departments, because in academic departments, you have the right to close the door. You stay out. I do my thing. You know, there is no pushing in that sense. And these guys, they actually extend in their influence beyond the economic field. I just would like to point to you 2 actors that are particularly important at the current moment. Janet Yellen, who, after being a professor at Berkeley on labor economics, a student of one, like in touch with Joe Stiglitz, she became the Fed governor of San Francisco, later on the Fed governor tout court, as we like to say in French, and then today is the Treasury Secretary. And she is driving an attempt to address the macro-prudential problems of our times by seeking to regulate the hedge funds. And I hope I have enough time at the end to come to this point, because she fails nevertheless. So there are limits to this power, but they are a powerful actor that we have to look at. And so, in short, what I look at is how these new policy devices are produced that allow regulators to see, know, and regulate the cycle, how they are operationalized. And these are very difficult issues. And because you have not only to generate the data and identify the metrics, but you also, and that is the most important part, you have to identify trigger points for action. This is what my interviewees call actionable knowledge. Okay, so this here I show you one of the very first graphical representations of the financial cycle. And the financial cycle, so to speak, claims that here is a moment of upswing, and it's at this moment, as the financial markets get out of whack and become driven away by themselves, that regulators should intervene. Because as you can imagine, right, you don't want to intervene up here. You don't want to intervene at the top of the cycle, because then it's already too late. You want to intervene at the beginning to dampen the cycle, right? That means that you need, in essence, to anticipate what will happen in the next 3 years now. And you not only need to anticipate what will happen in the next 3 years, but you need to tell your Fed governing body, we need to intervene now. And that is a little bit like in the Middle Ages, when somebody called the advisor in and said, like the magician, the sorcerer, and said, tell me what will happen in 3 years from now and what should I do? So you can see the difficulties that come about for a Fed economist or for an ECB economist to make the case that we should intervene today to prevent something from happening 3 years from now, which becomes visible because he has manipulated some data with the help of some statistical filter, where it's not exactly clear if that really exists or is just an imagination. So just to show you the challenge that these guys were facing is, in a sense, they had to convince people that the financial cycle exists and that we can act on it. So what I did to write this book is I engaged in process tracing. I interviewed 77 applied economists and central bankers working on macroprudential regulation. And then I did, besides all the reading, I did a lot of text analysis, quantitative text analysis, to determine when exactly the financial cycle becomes an object that exists. Okay, and based on 70,000 documents, like papers in academic journals, I can show that it's from 2012 to 2017 in this time window that the financial cycle as an object starts to really exist in the academic discourse as an acknowledged element. Okay, and so it's a historical and comparative approach where I start in the 1970s, and that was a huge surprise to me because I thought I only do the 2000s and I'm done. And as I went there, I had to go ever more back and ever more back. So the discussion starts in the 1970s, and then I look at how this actually implemented in these different countries. So to give you the historical narrative, and I don't know how I'm doing on time. How much time do I have?
Still have some.
I still have some time, okay. It's very informative. Some time. I will interpret it in my own manner. I will take some time then. But I mean, I have time. I don't have a train to catch today. So what I started to look at, and it's great that Ben is in the room because Ben has written a great paper on this with his co-authors. I started to look at it from the 1970s, where at the Bank for International Settlement, the Euro Currency Standing Group is founded. And that's a group of central bankers that is de facto really worried about the financial innovation, where all these euro dollars start to circulate around. And they don't really know what to do with it. They're just really worried because they say, damn, most likely we will have to bail out the banks involved in this capital market. And so even if they can't agree because the US and the UK really have, or so Ben suggests, political economy interest in the growth of this market, it's even worse than that because they are not only internally divided, but they're also dominated by the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. And you may have heard of this Basel Committee. And in the archives, you can actually find how the head of the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, at this point, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, goes over to the Euro Currency Standing Group and tells them, literally, you can't speak. You do not have the right to voice your concerns. Because people might think that we also are concerned about these things, and we are not. However, what happens in the 1990s is that rising financial instability, the Mexico crisis, the East Asian financial crisis, and the dot-com bust starts to empower this thought collective. Because while they're still dominated by this Basel Committee, you can see how they get institutional allies. The Financial Stability Forum is installed. The IMF starts to look at financial stability, and the BIS gets power. And what I was most happy about as a find for my own research was that there actually starts to be a field of collaboration between academics and central bankers from 1995 onwards, where they start to think together about financial stability. And what is fascinating to me is actually that, like, through very painstaking work, I could find that it's the Euro Currency Standing Group that understands that they are weak, that they have no power. And they understand why they have no power, because they have no concepts. They have just some graphs. And so they say, we need to have academic research that undergirds our interventions. And so they give money to have these conferences. And the first conference will be in 1995 in New York, at the Fed in New York. And Alan Greenspan will give the very first speech. And Alan Greenspan, you may think of as the last person that has something positive to say about systemic risk. But the speech, the intervention he gives is really fascinating because he says, as a central banker, we're always aware of the fact that we have to back up the financial markets, that there is the risk that we as the central bank have to bail them out. And we want to understand how much risk-taking we should allow. And then he says, well, unfortunately, we don't have this. So, but maybe you can help us, to all these academics in the room. And then when you read these documents and these discussions, it becomes clear that the academics and the Fed are very much against systemic risk thinking at the time. And I find it funny because I'm not an economist, but maybe the economists in the room can find themselves in this description, because an economist from the Fed tells his colleagues, you shall not speak of systemic risk if you have no model in which systemic risk can be modeled, because it does not exist if you do not have a model for it. So it's like something that you cannot model does not exist. And this stance, you can find it also in 1998 in Tokyo at the next iteration of this conference, only that at this moment in time, the central bank governor of Japan says, but we just had the East Asian financial crisis. So I'm really sorry to say, but it does exist. So the reality invites itself, in a sense, into the modeling and into the discourse in this way, okay? And so I show how many different concepts and themes develop at this point in time. Franklin Allen, I think he gave a speech here. He was one of the first working on this, actually. And so I interviewed him, if I may say so, for this book. And many different concepts and themes appear, and the financial cycle is really just one idea among many, to be honest. But the BIS is really pushing for it. And so what then happens in 2007 and 2008 is both what you could be called a huge rhetorical victory and an absolute policy defeat for the macro-prudential policy thinkers. When we read the first announcements of 2007 by the Financial Stability Forum, signed by Mario Draghi, we find the discourse of macro-pru all over the place. It's all there. It's a negative interaction between financial markets and the banks. There is pro-cyclicality. Financial markets have exaggerated and now they're snapping back. So the discourse is really there. Yet when we look at what actually becomes implemented, there's only one tiny little measure, that is the counter-cyclical capital buffer. And what is fascinating about the counter-cyclical capital buffer, and I don't want to go too much into detail because I don't want to bother you too much with this, is who says counter-cyclical buffer says cycle. Because without cycle, you can't have a counter-cyclical buffer. And so these guys in that moment have to start to think about how they actually measure the cycle. They fail miserably in the discussion of the regulation of what comes to be called shadow banking. Miserably. They're laughed out of the room. The market regulators say, what are you talking about? And they have nothing to prove that there is systemic risk coming from the shadow banking system, which will set off this frantic almost endeavor to generate the evidence that it is there. And so when we look at it, the only real success, and I was lucky enough to be able to interview a person that was there, the countercyclical capital buffer really comes in at the very last moment, and it's installed against the opposition of the economists in the room. The economists want to use the market, want to use market disciplining devices, and their only problem is that Basel III is supposed to be for the G20. It's supposed to be international. It's supposed to be for Africa. It's supposed to be for China. And there is no market data for Africa, for many countries at this point in time. And so the regulators from these countries say, we can't use this, forget about it. And so they decide to put in the counter-cyclical capital buffer. But when I interviewed him, he said, in the end, it was a decision that was made because the majority of guys in the room thinks that there's a need to signal change. Political need to signal change. It's not the conviction of these guys. And why I'm telling you this is the economists and central banks will spend the next 10 years trying to figure out what the cycle is and when they should raise the counter-cyclical capital buffer. They don't know. In Europe, they bring together 120 economists from different central banks and they say, well, let's take the data and let's try to figure out when there are these exaggerations, when there are these housing booms that go through the roof, and when we should intervene. And it's only after several years that they start to become confident in their capacity to predict these problems. This is in the Eurozone, where they really work the most on the cycle. In the UK, they are more pragmatic. And there's a nice interview quote that I have where the guy tells me, look, we'll never be guided by this idea that we can pinpoint exactly where we are in the cycle. This is nonsense. But we sit together, the 10 of us, and we will discuss. And if these measures help us to make sense of the situation, then we will intervene. It is what is called the gentlemanly culture in the UK that allows them to operate in this way. In the US, the resistance to the cycle is the strongest. One, because academia really doesn't buy it. So the American academia is really opposed to it. The other reason is that the Fed doesn't really have a lot of control over the financial system as a whole. So what happens in the end is that they put all their efforts into stress tests. And you know of stress tests are these simulations, which then allows them to say, in order to deal with these crises, you need to raise your capital level. And what is interesting to me is that at some point, they introduce a cyclical dimension into the stress test without telling anybody. But that allows them to say, oh, we think that we are going a little bit more exaggerated, so please raise your capital buffer because there's a problem. But they seek to avoid the political oversight. They seek to avoid the public, okay? And so this hard work for applied technocratic economists, I think it really does make a difference as they seek to generate actionable knowledge. And those of you who are economists, and there are many economists in the room, as I've heard, I invite you to read, if you want, this paper by Adrian et al. It's about a measure that is called growth at risk, and it uses quintile regressions in order to predict problems 3 years from now. And this paper is built, I interviewed one of the authors, to generate actionable knowledge. And I asked him, what do you mean actionable knowledge? He said, look, this was initially built for the FOMC, so for the Federal Open Market Committee, where the people sit together, and he says, I wanted to make them a measure that could tell them, you need to act now. So actionable knowledge is this idea to, generate a necessity to act. And this, they succeeded. And they succeeded so well that this paper now is published in the American Economic Review. And the IMF is using this measure on all the countries on this planet to measure growth at risk, to measure the likelihood of a future financial crisis. However, it didn't get implemented in the US. And that's where it really matters. So you could describe it as an attack on the Bastille, only that in this case, the Bastille didn't fall. That doesn't travel in this country.
I'm sorry, if you want to leave any place to discussion,
yes,
I think you have to conclude.
Thank you very much. So they failed for shadow banking. And so I give in the book why they fail for shadow banking. And so let me just come quickly. Thank you to the COVID crisis. Central banks become increasingly the market makers of last resort, and they become so because of financial stability concerns. So these concerns about finance being really fragile now becomes a tool to justify why central banks need to intervene when there is trouble. And so in 2020, and this is just showing you the growth of the central bank balance sheets, in 2020, the Fed will pump in March 2020 several $1 trillion into the financial system. And the reason for that is all the knowledge that I document in the book. So these economists, they do make a difference, but they don't make a difference in the upswing, because nobody has the courage or the conviction to go against finance when things are in the boom phase. But when the bust threatens, these guys, with their knowledge that they have produced about the possibly devastating effects of finance, motivate these central banks to intervene. And so what I'm trying to say then is, there is a perversion of the idea of the financial cycle in that the booms are not addressed, but in the downswing they are addressed. And it's really absolutely fascinating to me that in the upswing, these economists have to provide evidence and evidence and ever more evidence before they can do anything. But in the downswing, nobody asks any question. We have to act now. 500 billion, no problem. We want to make a rule to limit the leverage of hedge funds because they pose a problem, maybe for financial stability. How do you know they are risky? Where's your evidence? Where's your econometric evidence? Please prove. So there is this asymmetry that is, and here I will end, what leads from my perspective to the unhappy consciousness of central bankers. Aware of the financial fragility of the financial system, they have no way currently of changing the financial system. I think that might be different in Africa, it might be different in China, but right now in the US and in Europe, it is pretty much the case. And so for me, the metaphor of a firefighter, the way that people like Timothy Geithner or Bernanke describe themselves, is somehow fitting, but it leaves out one thing. To me, it's a firefighter who knows that the house that he's guarding is easily inflammable, okay? And he has the foam to fight the fire. Quantitative easing will kill all the fire of financial instability, okay? But he has no capacity to change the house. He cannot remove the foam that puts it on fire. And so the unhappy consciousness of the central banker is that he's faced with a structure that he knows is very fragile, but he cannot change it. He can only intervene to save it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now we are going to listen to the discussant, please.
Please.
Thank you, Dr. Thiemann, for that fascinating presentation. And let me say that I read all this book last week when I received a soft copy of it, and it's a really fascinating book. And I would, so I want to begin by saying why I think people should read it. And to me, what it provides is a really insightful case study of how very complex economic ideas related to financial regulation, which are complex, are translated into policy actions or not translated into policy actions, as the case may be. And it will be of interest to people in a range of disciplines, I think, economists, obviously, in finance, and people working in the field of political science, but also to people who, like myself, who have, specialized in providing technical advice to policymakers, because it really tells us something about how policies are implemented, and the very complex ways in which they are, and the constraints. And a second advantage of this book is that Dr. Thiemann is able to take a big picture view of the evolution of financial regulation since the global financial crisis. And it's a big picture which is often lost when, we look at, as economists, at the minutiae of financial regulation, when we look at capital adequacy ratios and what will a small change in capital adequacy ratio achieve or not achieve. And to give one example of this, he shows very clearly how there has been a fundamental change in the way in which central banks act to backstop the liquidity in financial markets since the global financial crisis. The final chart which he showed in his presentation was the liquidity provision, I think during the cash for cash crisis at the start of the COVID pandemic, when central banks in the Western countries pumped in trillions of dollars to stabilize financial markets. And this is a quantitative and especially qualitative change in the way in which central banks provide liquidity. It's fundamentally different from the traditional lender of last resort policies, which central bankers are very familiar with, from the days of Bagehot. And it's clear we have left those days long behind us now, at least in the Western world. And so I think this big picture view of financial regulation, I think that may well come from the fact that Dr. Thiemann is a sociologist and is able to look at it from a much wider perspective and bring in the insights of different academic disciplines in the way in which, unfortunately, our own discipline of economics neglects at times. So the methodology which he has adopted in this book, which he outlined, is this viabilities approach. And he looks at three types of viabilities: the viability of economic ideas, the bureaucratic and administrative viabilities, and the political viabilities. And you have to have all three of those in order to translate an economic idea into actual policies. And that's very useful, I think, in enabling us to diagnose why policies may fail to be implemented. Because again, in our discipline, we often take a rather simplistic view of what are the constraints to policies being implemented. We assume that our ideas are good, And if they don't get implemented, it's because of vested interests, you know, in politics, which stop good ideas being put into practice. But it is actually much more complex and nuanced than that. And this approach, this viabilities approach, looking at the three different aspects, is a very good way, I think, of trying to understand it in a better way and reach a deeper understanding. And it could be applied to other fields too, besides regulation. Now, I want to say a few words about this idea of the economic viability of the macro-prudential and financial cycle. Because as Dr. Thiemann pointed out, almost all of the work which has been done to better understand the financial cycle, the macro-financial cycle, has been done by applied economists working in central banks and to some extent in international organizations like the BIS and the IMF. There has been a very little contribution from academic economists, and especially before the financial crisis. And that does not really reflect very well on our discipline, I don't think. And I think it's worth considering why, and also considering, to understand that, let's consider the difference between our academic understanding of the microeconomic problems in banking, which has led to a rationale for macro-prudential regulation, and the differences with the financial cycle, our understanding of the financial cycle. In the case of the microeconomic failures and micro-prudential regulation, these have been quite well understood and well analysed in academic work for a long time. And some of you will be familiar with a book written in the early 1990s on the prudential regulation of banks by Jean Tirole and Matthias, which very comprehensively set out the rationale for micro-prudential of banks in terms of microeconomic failures. And these were well understood because they largely stem from informational failures, which had been understood since the early 1970s from the work of Stiglitz and Weiss and Akerlof. And it was possible to understand and model these failures within the neoclassical intellectual paradigm which dominates the academic discipline. And so it was possible to for these ideas to be accepted within the economic discipline, the economic profession, and to be acted upon, to be implemented as micro-prudential regulation. That was not the case with the notion of the financial cycle. And as Dr. Thiemann pointed out, the idea of a financial cycle was not unknown. It was sketched out by Hyman Minsky in the 1980s. And Minsky's ideas were well known among economists working in finance, especially in central banks. But it was almost impossible to translate Minsky's ideas into a formal model. And within the neoclassical paradigm, I don't think it was ever done before, certainly before the financial crisis. And as Dr. Thiemann pointed out, if you can't model something in economics, it's largely ignored. And that has serious real-world consequences, as we saw in the global financial crisis. Something which people knew about, at least in the back of their minds, knew was a possibility, was largely ignored and not acted upon in the build-up to the financial crisis. And that is not to the credit of our discipline at all.
I'm afraid that if you want to leave place to some discussion, you also have to come.
Okay, let me just end upon the final note, which is this: as the presentation ended on, this really bad situation we are in now. And as Dr. Thiemann said, central banks are in the invidious position where they know that the structure is fragile, but they cannot act to dampen the upswing of the cycle. But it's even worse than that in some ways, in that because they act to mitigate the problems in the downswing of the cycle by pumping in liquidity, they're actually creating moral hazard, which gives incentives for the actors in the shadow banking system, for example, to take on excessive risks in the upswing of the cycle, because they know they're going to be bailed out when things go bad, if things do go bad. So in some ways, this very asymmetrical approach to intervention is making things worse. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for these insights. Well, technically, we have minus 5 minutes to discuss, so I don't know what we should do. Either we can suppress the discussion, or do you give us some more time? Okay, yeah, but until when? What is the limit that we should target? At what time do you want us to stop?
The last session.
Yeah, I know that, but
10 minutes.
okay. So I will ask you, number one, to ask very short questions. And well, depending on the number of questions, either the speaker will have time to answer or not, because he has eaten up several times into his answering. There is something I learned at Sciences Po 50 years ago. The only thing you learn at Sciences Po is you have 15 minutes, you speak 15 minutes. So, okay, so I'll teach you later. Okay, please.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really very interesting. I should be quick, therefore I'm diving right into it. Finance is obviously in the middle of a framework. And as I understand it, it would be better if central bankers could have a say in what kind of other framework is actually acted upon. So how can we make sure that this is considered? Because largely governments do not necessarily listen to central bankers.
We collect all the questions, and you will answer to everybody at the end, if any time is left. Please. Yes. So, yeah, where? Yes.
It's just a small comment. My thinking about regulation and the banking system is that when you look at the evolution of Basel, Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, it seems to me that sometimes regulator is late to adapt the regulation to the changes that occur in the banking system. And this is what was seen, especially during the crisis of 2007 and 2008. So for me, it's maybe it could be interesting for the regulator to be more quicker to observe what is happening in the banking or the financial system as a whole, and try to adapt very more quickly the regulation. I think that it won't address all of the systemic risks, but at some point it will address some issues.
Really interesting presentation. You talked a lot about individuals as well. So you mentioned, for example, Janet Yellen and her influence. The commentator mentioned an article by Akerlof and Stiglitz. Stiglitz had some influence. Akerlof, of course, is married to Janet Yellen. But I suppose the question is a bit sort of difference between the UK and US. So you didn't say much about individuals in the case of the UK. And I think so somebody like Adair Turner, for example, was very quick off the mark to say there are systematic failures, and discussion we've had also with him and Stephanie Griffith-Jones so about cyclicality issues, and he was quite quickly convinced that there could be something like there's too much finance. that was not necessarily accepted, I think, and it took a bit of a long time, that there could be something like too much finance, and you need to regulate that, and perhaps you need to think about countercyclical measures. So that there could be finance chasing finance rather than thinking about the finance for the real sector. And I think that's in the UK something changed there, and Andy Haldane, for example, also did some papers on that. So is there a difference between UK and US? And you said that the US something was not implemented, in the UK something was implemented. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Victor?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting, Matthias. Very interesting indeed. I agree with the analysis and very interesting, convincing. I'm struggling to find solutions or remedies to the problems you are setting across. And I started to take an excursion into, for example, will central bank digital currencies provide proofs so that the central bankers don't abuse their authorities when they should be doing it? For example, why is it that central banks can't go bust and declare completely they can't operate anymore? And then we would know that they are not fulfilling their role. Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, so I wanted to hear your perspective on central banks and their price stability mission. I know this is about macro-prudential regulation, but it does seem like they've been successful at raising interest rates to try to cool the market. And I'm wondering why you think that's the case. I mean, is it because there are different interests that are affected, maybe labor and rather than finance? Is it because we have more developed models that sort of empowers the economists versus over the politicians? Thanks.
You, please.
Yeah, so thanks for your analysis. Being someone who studied risk management, I found some things a little bit, I was in the part that actually knew about these things before they happened. But my question for you is, it seems that you missed out one aspect of this entire long period that you've looked at, which is financial innovation. And so I'm just wondering how you sort of, you can reconcile that aspect of what was really going on at every stage. So every bust has come with a different cycle of financial innovation. And you cited Tobias Adrian. He's actually written a paper on that as well.
Any further short question? Okay, so I will add maybe 2 points. Well, the first one is, of course, if we remember a little bit what happened at the time of the global financial crisis, what we called shadow banking was actually off-balance sheet activities and securitization. And this seems to have vanished from your perspective. So is it that, well, central bankers, regulators have short memory, or is it that these things have disappeared, or are they only second order, or whatever? Second point, maybe more important. I think, frankly, from an economist's point of view, what is missing from your view is what happened before the crisis. What was the situation? We all remember it. There was a lot of debate about whether monetary policy should consider asset prices overeating or not. And the basic conclusion was, we are basically not able to know whether there is overeating or not overeating. I mean, we also remember Alan Greenspan, irrational exuberance and all the stories. So all these things, I think they were debated for a long time. So now this leads to a related point, because you mentioned QE a lot of time, but QE is monetary policy. It is not macro-prudential policy. So in some way, I mean, as a trained monetary economist and so on and so forth, my view is to say, yes, you have a point, but maybe we would have needed a chapter on monetary policy.
Yeah.
I think that if you have a sequel or a second edition or something like this, this might, or in your further work, because I understand that this is ongoing work. So, okay, please answer quickly.
Okay, let me go backwards and say, first of all, that having finished the book, I realized that I am not talking about monetary policy, and since then I'm working on that. So indeed, what is maybe, but taking that into account, what is maybe one can even restate the puzzle even of this book even more accurately, which is through quantitative easing, which does explicitly mention financial stability concerns. So it's not me that is saying they're doing it because of financial stability concerns. Is the central bankers and say, because we know everything about financial stability, we are intervening with QE, that financial stability concerns have entered into monetary policy, but only in the downswing and not in the upswing. So asset prices do not play a role as they go up. And where are we today? Just an update on 2024. Today there, and that's the paper that I'm working on right now, they are taken into account in a qualitative fashion. There is no model. So they are discussing it, but they don't know what to do about it. And the paper that I'm writing on is showing how these economists are sitting in the FOMC and they tell the staff of the Fed, do you have a model? Can you please give me a trade-off? How do I take monetary policy and financial stability into account? How do I do it? And the economists cannot give that model, at least until 2018, because after that, I can't read the FOMC anymore. So, but in 2018, that's where the debate stops. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating and important question. So you're right. But sometimes you realize things when you're done with the book. So you have to. So you have the next book. Okay, so the question number 7 that I have here, what happened with off-balance sheet and securitization? Has it vanished? Has it disappeared? Yes, I think it has largely disappeared. This is the first book that I wrote that is dealing with this, but it also links to the other question. Every financial bust comes with a particular financial innovation. I think, and this is where the question of zooming out maybe becomes important. The linkage of capital market and banking business that is I think, at the source of financial instability for the last 30 years. This linkage is still there. It takes different forms, different venues, but non-banks using banks to finance their leverage strategies in one way or another, off balance sheet, or is the pattern that stays, even if the innovation itself is different. So I think in that sense, I can permit myself to abstract a little bit from this concrete financial innovations, but you're right. So why is price stability, why are they capable of raising interest rates? Is it because of the models and so on? I think this is a brilliant question that relates to the point on the need to include monetary policy into the question. I do think that there is many decades of actually hard work to push financial stability out of the picture. So these models, the DSGE models and all of these models, as you may know, if you're the economist in the room, they are based on the assumption that we can safely ignore financial markets, that the efficient market hypothesis does operate. So when you remember the table that I showed you at the beginning, monetary policy is still mostly in the efficient market hypothesis world with monetary frictions, financial frictions added on top of it. So sometimes there are some financial frictions, but and I think this is actually, and I'll be quick, this is the real place where work needs to be done, also where economists, I think, are really urgently needed to rethink macroeconomics in a way that allows to integrate monetary policy and financial stability. And that's probably something that I can't do. I will be a bit picky and just pick. Is there a difference between the US and the UK? I love that you brought up Adair Turner, who has done a lot of great things in his work, also in the Financial Stability Board and so on. The idea that there could be finance chasing finance and that there could be too much finance, indeed, is an idea that he has carried. But we can observe the power of financial interests, that this idea in particular did not have a great career 10 years later. So he wrote the book, right, between the debt and the devil. That's a brilliant book, I think, personally. But it's a notion that there could be too much finance that is not very actively pursued in the policy discourse these days. You may hear that finance can be fragile, but the idea that there could be too much finance so directly, so provocatively, I think it has disappeared, which shows you the capacity of the financial industry to normalize a particular consensus that excludes the most dangerous ideas. And that's something that I'm not really doing in the book, but it's a response. I think that it is fascinating to me that very smart people that have been working on these issues. Haldane is right now doing what? He's curating a art gallery, I think. Don't mean to be nasty, but I think that, sorry. Okay, see that should be careful when you say stuff. Okay, but yeah, others get hired by BlackRock. So Brazier, Joe Brazier or something, who was a big guy at the Bank of England, speaking about shadow banking, and then in 2019 he stopped there and he moved to BlackRock Institute, where he's writing now all the anti-regulation speeches with exactly the same input, but he switched sides. So I think we see again the capacity of industry to hire the smartest and the best. So this rather we're in that sense we're in a dangerous territory. And there I agree really with David's point that the current setup encourages risk-taking and profitability that leads to the industry being capable of financing their ideologues. How to listen to CB's framework? In a sense, I would like to thank you very much for this question, because this is exactly the question that I'm trying to show in the book, that you have these central bankers, particular central bankers that say we have a problem and they're not listened to. And it's, in the words of one central banker, he calls it prudential market regulation. He says the idea that financial markets themselves don't only need micro-regulation of the consumer, the investor, and so on, but also of the system as a whole. And as he himself said in 2016, he has been famously unsuccessful in convincing the market regulators that makes sense. Carolio.
No, I think you
I'm
really
done.
have to finish. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very
Good.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you for all your time. Thank you.
Apologies for my mismanagement.
So you managed very well, thanks Matthias. So that's a very rich book. So I think maybe for people who are doing research in this area, they should read the book. Now, I think we have been here for 2 days. So I think maybe it's time that we close the meeting.